Welcome to Midnight and Murder, a crime storytelling series for sleeping, where crime meets calm and mystery meets the mind at rest. Today we have a special mob series. Let's go. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. February 14, 1929, began like any other winter morning in Chicago. Snow blanketed the streets, and the bitter cold kept most people indoors. But inside a garage at 2122 North Clark Street, 7 men were about to become victims of one of the most notorious mob hits in American history. The Prohibition era had turned Chicago into a battlefield. 2 major gangs controlled the city's lucrative bootlegging operations: Al Capone's Southside Italian Gang and Bugs Moran's Northside Irish Gang. For years, these organizations had been locked in a violent struggle for territory, each murder escalating the conflict further. On that Valentine's morning, members of Moran's gang had gathered at the SMC Cartage warehouse. They believed they were meeting to purchase a shipment of hijacked whiskey at a bargain price. What they didn't know was that the entire operation was an elaborate trap orchestrated by Al Capone himself. At approximately 10:30 a.m., a black Cadillac pulled up outside the warehouse. 4 men emerged, 2 dressed as Chicago police officers, 2 in civilian clothes. The fake officers entered the building first, announcing a routine raid. They ordered the 7 men inside to line up against the brick wall, hands raised, faces to the wall. The victims complied without resistance. They had been through police raids before, and this seemed routine. Johnny May, a mechanic who worked on the gang's cars, stood alongside the gangsters. Frank Gusenberg, one of Moran's most trusted lieutenants, muttered under his breath about the inconvenience. None of them suspected what was about to happen. The 2 men in civilian clothes entered next, carrying Thompson submachine guns. Without warning, they opened fire. The garage filled with the deafening sound of automatic gunfire and the screams of dying men. Over 70 rounds were fired in less than a minute. The brick wall became painted with blood, and bodies crumpled to the cold concrete floor. When the shooting stopped, the fake officers pretended to arrest the 2 shooters, marching them out with hands raised to maintain the illusion of a police operation. Neighbors who heard the gunfire assumed that they had witnessed a legitimate police raid gone wrong. Minutes later, the real police arrived to find a scene of unprecedented carnage. 6 men were dead, their bodies riddled with bullets. Frank Gusenberg, incredibly, was still alive despite 14 bullet wounds. When detectives asked who shot him, he reportedly replied, "No one shot me." He died hours later without revealing anything more. Bugs Moran himself had narrowly escaped death. He was running late that morning and arrived at the warehouse just as the fake police car was pulling up. Suspicious, he watched from across the street and left when he saw what appeared to be a police raid in progress. His tardiness saved his life, but cost him most of his organization. The massacre shocked the nation and marked the beginning of the end for Al Capone. While he was never formally charged with the murders, the brutal execution turned public opinion against him. The federal government intensified its efforts to bring down his empire, eventually succeeding when they convicted him of tax evasion in 1931. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre became a symbol of the lawlessness of the Prohibition era. It demonstrated how organized crime had grown bold enough to carry out military-style operations in broad daylight, disguised as law enforcement. The 7 victims became martyrs in the public's mind, their deaths representing the innocent casualties of America's failed experiment with alcohol prohibition. The murder of Salvatore Maranzano. The year 1931 marked a turning point in American organized crime, a moment when the old world met the new in the most violent way possible. Salvatore Maranzano, known as the Boss of Bosses, sat in his Park Avenue office on September 10th, conducting what he believed was routine business. He had no idea that his own protege had marked him for death. Maranzano had arrived in America from Sicily in 1918, bringing with him the traditional structure and codes of the Sicilian mafia. He was a learned man, fascinated by Roman history and the tactics of Julius Caesar. He saw himself as a Caesar of the criminal underworld, destined to rule over all the Italian crime families in America. His opportunity came during the Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict that raged from 1929 to 1931 between 2 factions of New York's Italian-American crime families. On one side stood Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria, representing the old guard of Italian-American criminals. Opposing him was Maranzano, backed by recent immigrants from the town of Castellammare del Golfo in Sicily. The war was brutal and chaotic, with bodies dropping regularly across New York City. Restaurants became battlefields, and trusted allies turned into deadly enemies overnight. The violence was so intense that it began attracting unwanted attention from law enforcement and the press. A young and ambitious gangster named Charles Lucky Luciano found himself caught between these two powerful forces. Luciano was different from the old-school bosses. He was American-born, spoke perfect English, and understood that the future of organized crime lay in cooperation, not endless warfare. He saw both Masseria and Maranzano as obstacles to progress. In April 1931, Luciano made his first move. He arranged for Joe Masseria to be assassinated while eating lunch at a Coney Island restaurant. With Masseria dead, Maranzano declared himself the winner of the Castellammare's War and proclaimed himself boss of bosses over all Italian crime families in America. But Maranzano's victory was short-lived. He established a rigid hierarchy based on the Sicilian model, with himself at the top and various underbosses beneath him. This traditional structure clashed with Luciano's vision of a more democratic and profitable confederation of crime families. Maranzano made a critical error in judgment. He began to see Luciano as a threat to his authority and started planning to eliminate him. However, Luciano's network of informants was superior, and he learned of the plot against him. Rather than wait to become a victim, Luciano decided to strike first. On that September afternoon, 4 men entered Maranzano's office building at 230 Park Avenue. They identified themselves as federal agents and demanded to see Maranzano for questioning. His bodyguards, not wanting to interfere with what appeared to be a legitimate federal investigation, allowed the men to pass. The agents entered Maranzano's private office, where he was meeting with several business associates. They ordered everyone except Maranzano to leave the room. Once alone with their target, the men revealed their true purpose. They were not federal agents, but professional killers sent by Lucky Luciano. What happened next was swift and brutal. The assassins stabbed Maranzano multiple times and then shot him to ensure he was dead. They left his body slumped over his desk, blood pooling on the papers he had been reviewing. The entire operation took less than 15 minutes. The murder of Salvatore Maranzano was more than just another gangland killing. It represented a seismic shift in American organized crime. Luciano used Maranzano's death to eliminate the old Sicilian power structure and replace it with his own vision of organized crime: the Commission. This new system divided territories among 5 New York families and established rules for conducting business and resolving disputes without war. It was a remarkably sophisticated approach that would govern American organized crime for decades to come. The irony was not lost on those who understood the situation. Maranzano, who had fashioned himself after Julius Caesar, met the same fate as his historical hero: betrayal and assassination by those closest to him. His death marked the end of the old world and the beginning of what would become known as the modern American mafia. The assassination of Albert Anastasia. The Park Sheraton Hotel's barbershop in Manhattan was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where even the most dangerous men could relax and enjoy the simple pleasure of a good shave and haircut. On October 25, 1957, that sanctuary became a slaughterhouse when Albert Anastasia, one of America's most feared crime bosses, was gunned down while getting his morning grooming. Anastasia was known throughout the underworld as the Lord High Executioner, a nickname that reflected his role as the head of Murder, Inc., the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate. For nearly 2 decades, he had been responsible for countless deaths, orchestrating murders with the cold efficiency of a corporate executive managing a business. Born Umberto Anastasio in Calabria, Italy, he had immigrated to America as a teenager and quickly gravitated toward Brooklyn's docks, where his family had connections. The waterfront was a rough place where violence was a daily reality, and Anastasia proved exceptionally gifted at both giving and surviving it. By the 1930s, he had become the undisputed boss of Brooklyn's docks, controlling the longshoremen's union through a combination of fear and strategic generosity. Workers who crossed him simply disappeared, while those who remained loyal found steady work and protection. It was a simple but effective system that made Anastasia incredibly wealthy and powerful. His reputation for violence was legendary even among hardened criminals. Other mobsters spoke of him in whispers, sharing stories of his explosive temper and his willingness to kill over the smallest perceived slights. He was said to have personally murdered dozens of men, and he had ordered the deaths of hundreds more. But by 1957, Anastasia's reign of terror was facing challenges from multiple directions. Younger mobsters questioned his old-fashioned methods and his reluctance to embrace new opportunities in narcotics trafficking. His own underboss, Carlo Gambino, was quietly building alliances with other crime families while positioning himself as a more reasonable alternative to Anastasia's volatile leadership. The morning of October 25th began routinely for Anastasia. He drove from his Fort Lee, New Jersey mansion to Manhattan, planning to attend to various business matters. His first stop was the Park Sheraton Hotel's barbershop on the ground floor, where he was a regular customer. Arthur Grasso, the head barber, greeted Anastasia warmly as he entered the shop around 10:15 a.m. Anastasia settled into chair number 4, his usual spot, and Grasso began preparing him for a shave and haircut. The crime boss closed his eyes and relaxed as the barber worked, hot towels covering his face. What Anastasia didn't know was that 2 men had been waiting for him. They had studied his routines and knew that he visited the barbershop every Tuesday morning at approximately the same time. They also knew that he would be at his most vulnerable while getting shaved, unable to see or move quickly. At 10:20 a.m., 2 men wearing fedoras and overcoats entered the barbershop. They moved with purpose but without urgency, as if they belonged there. Arthur Grasso looked up from his work, about to greet the new customers, when he saw the guns in their hands. "Keep quiet and nobody gets hurt," one of the gunmen said calmly. The other customers and barbers froze in terror, understanding immediately what was about to happen. Anastasia, hearing unfamiliar voices, opened his eyes and tried to sit up, but the hot towel was still draped across his face. As he pulled it away, he found himself looking directly at 2 men pointing revolvers at him. The gunmen opened fire simultaneously, shooting Anastasia multiple times as he sat helpless in the barber chair. Desperate to escape, he lunged forward, crashing into the mirror in front of him. Blood splattered across the glass as he collapsed to the floor, his body riddled with bullets. The entire assassination took less than 30 seconds. The gunmen walked calmly out of the barbershop, through the hotel lobby, and disappeared into the crowded Manhattan streets. They were never identified or caught, despite an intensive police investigation. Arthur Grasso and the other witnesses claimed they were too traumatized to provide useful descriptions of the killers. This was almost certainly a lie born of fear, but police could not prove otherwise. The murder remained officially unsolved, though everyone in the underworld knew who was responsible. Carlo Gambino, Anastasia's underboss, immediately took control of the crime family with the blessing of the other New York bosses. His rise had been carefully orchestrated, with the assassination serving as the final step in a long-term plan to modernize and stabilize the organization. The murder of Albert Anastasia marked the end of an era in American organized crime. The old-school bosses who ruled through fear and violence were being replaced by more sophisticated leaders who understood that excessive brutality was bad for business. The barbershop assassination became a symbol of this transition, a reminder that even the most feared men could be eliminated when they outlived their usefulness. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa, July 30th, 1975, was supposed to be just another day in the controversial life of Jimmy Hoffa, the former president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. He had planned a simple lunch meeting at a suburban Detroit restaurant, expecting to sit down with 2 men who might help him reclaim his lost power. Instead, he vanished without a trace, becoming the most famous missing person in American criminal history. Hoffa's story began in the depths of the Great Depression, when he was a young truck driver organizing his fellow workers against exploitative employers. He possessed a rare combination of street smarts, negotiating skills, and absolute fearlessness that made him a natural leader. By the 1950s, he had clawed his way to the top of the Teamsters Union, transforming it into one of America's most powerful labor organizations. But power came with a price. The Teamsters Pension Fund became a virtual bank for organized crime families across the country, providing loans for casinos, real estate developments, and other ventures that legitimate banks wouldn't touch. Hoffa walked a dangerous tightrope, maintaining relationships with mobsters while trying to serve his union members' interests. His downfall began in the 1960s when Attorney General Robert Kennedy launched a relentless campaign against organized crime and union corruption. Kennedy saw Hoffa as a symbol of everything wrong with American labor relations, and he pursued him with personal intensity that bordered on obsession. In 1967, Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering and fraud, sentenced to 13 years in federal prison. He refused to resign from the Teamsters presidency, instead running the union from his jail cell through loyal lieutenants. This arrangement infuriated both the government and rival factions within the union who saw an opportunity to seize power. President Richard Nixon commuted Hoffa's sentence in 1971, but with a crucial condition. Hoffa was banned from participating in union activities until 1980. This restriction was devastating for a man who had devoted his entire adult life to the labor movement. Hoffa immediately began fighting the ban in court while simultaneously trying to negotiate his way back into power through back-channel deals. By 1975, Hoffa believed he was close to a breakthrough. Frank Fitzsimmons, his hand-picked successor as Teamsters president, had proven to be more independent than expected, but Hoffa thought he could still reclaim control. He had been reaching out to old allies and making new connections, including controversial figures from organized crime families. The lunch meeting on July 30th was arranged through Anthony Giacalone, a Detroit mobster whom Hoffa had known for years. Giacalone claimed he could facilitate a sit-down between Hoffa and Anthony Provenzano, a New Jersey Teamsters official with strong mob ties. The meeting was supposedly designed to heal old wounds and discuss Hoffa's return to union leadership. Hoffa left his suburban Detroit home around 1 p.m., driving his green Pontiac Granville to the Machu's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township. He had told his wife Josephine that he would be back by 4 p.m. for dinner. He seemed optimistic about the meeting, believing it represented a crucial step toward reclaiming his former position. The restaurant was busy with the usual lunch crowd when Hoffa arrived around 2 p.m. He waited in the parking lot, expecting Giacalone and Provenzano to arrive shortly. According to witnesses, he seemed increasingly agitated as time passed, and his meeting partners failed to appear. Around 2:45 p.m., Hoffa called his wife from a payphone, telling her that the men he was supposed to meet had stood him up. He sounded frustrated but not alarmed. This was the last confirmed conversation anyone had with Jimmy Hoffa. What happened next remains one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. Hoffa's car was found unlocked in the restaurant parking lot, with no signs of a struggle. His keys were missing, and there were no witnesses to his departure. He had simply vanished, as if he had never existed. The FBI launched one of the longest and most expensive investigations in its history, following thousands of leads and interviewing countless suspects. They dug up fields, demolished buildings, and drained ponds, all in search of Hoffa's remains. Despite decades of effort and numerous claims from alleged witnesses, his body was never found. The most widely accepted theory is that Hoffa was killed by organized crime figures who saw him as a threat to their control of the Teamsters pension fund. His efforts to regain power would have jeopardized lucrative arrangements that had been established during his absence. Rather than risk this disruption, they decided to eliminate him permanently. Several mobsters later claimed to have knowledge of the murder, but their stories were contradictory and impossible to verify. Some said he was shot and cremated. Others claimed he was fed to pigs or dissolved in acid. The lack of physical evidence made it impossible to prosecute anyone for the crime. Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance became a cultural phenomenon, inspiring countless books, movies, and television shows. His name became synonymous with unsolved mysteries and the dark side of American labor relations. The question, "Where is Jimmy Hoffa?" entered the popular lexicon as shorthand for any mystery that seemed impossible to solve. The case officially remains open, and the FBI continues to investigate credible leads. But after nearly 50 years, it seems unlikely that the truth will ever be definitively established. Jimmy Hoffa achieved a form of immortality through his disappearance, becoming more famous in death than he ever was in life. The elimination of Paul Castellino, December 16, 1985, was a crisp winter evening in Manhattan, the kind of night when the city's lights seemed to sparkle with extra brilliance. Outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street, Christmas shoppers hurried past with their packages, unaware that they were about to witness one of the most audacious mob hits in New York history. Paul Castellano, the 70-year-old boss of the Gambino crime family, sat in the back seat of his black Lincoln town car as his driver maneuvered through the busy Manhattan traffic. Castellano was a study in contradictions, a man who lived in a palatial Staten Island mansion while running one of America's most violent criminal organizations. A grandfather who ordered murders with the same casual indifference he might use to order dinner. Known as Big Paul due to his imposing 6'3" frame, Castellano had risen to power in 1976, following the death of Carlo Gambino. His ascension had not been without controversy, as many members of the crime family believed the position should have gone to Gambino's underboss, Agnello Della Croce. However, Gambino had specifically chosen Castellano, his brother-in-law, as his successor. Castellano's leadership style was distinctly different from his predecessors. He was more of a businessman than a street tough, preferring to oversee the family's lucrative construction and labor racketeering operations from his Staten Island estate, rather than spending time in the social clubs and restaurants favored by traditional mobsters. This approach had made him wealthy beyond imagination, but had also created resentment among the family's younger members, particularly those involved in narcotics trafficking. Castellano had banned drug dealing within the Gambino family, viewing it as too risky and likely to attract federal attention. Many members ignored this edict, creating a dangerous schism within the organization. The most vocal opponent of Castellano's leadership was John Gotti, a charismatic captain who ran a crew in Queens. Gotti represented everything Castellano was not. He was flashy where Castellano was understated, violent where Castellano preferred negotiation, and popular with the rank-and-file soldiers where Castellano seemed distant and aloof. By 1985, the tension between Castellano and Gotti's faction had reached a breaking point. Federal investigators were closing in on several high-ranking Gambino members, including Castellano himself, who was facing trial on racketeering charges. Many family members worried that Castellano might cooperate with authorities to avoid spending his final years in prison. The situation became critical when Agnello Della Croce, the family's underboss, and the one person who could have mediated between the two factions, died of cancer in early December. With Della Croce gone, there was no one left to restrain Gotti's ambitions or protect Castellano from internal threats. Gotti began planning his move carefully, knowing that killing a sitting boss without permission from the other New York families was traditionally punishable by death. He needed to make his case carefully and ensure that he had enough support to survive the inevitable retaliation. The dinner meeting at Sparks Steakhouse on December 16th was supposed to be a routine sit-down between Castellano and several family captains to discuss ongoing business matters. Castellano had no reason to suspect danger. Such meetings were a regular part of his responsibilities as boss. As Castellano's Lincoln pulled up in front of the restaurant at approximately 5:25 p.m., four men dressed in identical white trench coats and fur hats approached from different directions. They moved with practiced precision, clearly having rehearsed this moment multiple times. Thomas Bellotti, Castellano's driver and bodyguard, stepped out of the car first and walked around to open the door for his boss. As Castellano emerged from the vehicle, the four gunmen simultaneously opened fire with automatic weapons. The attack was swift and overwhelming. Castellano was struck multiple times and fell to the sidewalk outside the restaurant entrance. Bellotti, realizing what was happening, tried to draw his own weapon but was cut down before he could fire a shot. Both men were dead within seconds. The gunmen calmly walked away from the scene, disappearing into the busy Manhattan streets before police could respond. Witnesses reported seeing the men get into waiting cars, but the vehicles were never located despite an intensive search. Inside Sparks Steakhouse, John Gotti sat at a table with several associates, ostensibly waiting for Castellano to arrive for their dinner meeting. When news of the shooting reached the restaurant, Gotti expressed shock and concern, playing his role perfectly. The murder of Paul Castellano sent shockwaves through the American underworld. Never before had a sitting boss been eliminated so publicly and brazenly. The hit demonstrated that the old rules and traditions that had governed organized crime for decades were breaking down. Within weeks, John Gotti had proclaimed himself the new boss of the Gambino family, claiming that he was simply filling a leadership vacuum created by Castellano's death. The other New York families, faced with a fait accompli, reluctantly accepted his ascension rather than risk a war. Gotti's victory was complete, but it came at a tremendous cost. The public nature of the Castellano assassination attracted unprecedented law enforcement attention to the Gambino family and to Gotti personally. FBI agents began following his every move, and federal prosecutors made destroying his organization their top priority. The killing outside Sparks Steakhouse marked the beginning of the end for the traditional American mafia. Gotti's flamboyant style and high-profile lifestyle made him a media celebrity, but also made him an easy target for law enforcement. Within 6 years, he would be convicted of murder and racketeering charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Paul Castellano's death became a symbol of how ambition and violence could destroy even the most powerful criminal organizations. The man who had tried to modernize and legitimize organized crime was ultimately killed by forces that represented everything he had tried to move away from: brutality, recklessness, and the primitive belief that might makes right. The execution of Carmine Galante. July 12, 1979, was a sweltering summer day in Brooklyn, the kind of oppressive heat that made even the most hardened criminals seek shade. At Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant in Bushwick, the lunch crowd was thinning out as the afternoon wore on. In the restaurant's back patio, surrounded by grapevines and the illusion of peaceful domesticity, sat one of the most feared men in New York, Carmine Galante. Known throughout the underworld as Lillo and the Cigar for his ever-present Cuban stogie, Galante was a man who inspired fear even among other mobsters. At 69 years old, he had spent most of his adult life either running criminal enterprises or serving time in federal prison. His reputation for violence was legendary, and his ambition was matched only by his complete disregard for the traditional rules that governed organized crime. Galante had been born in East Harlem to immigrant parents from Sicily, growing up in the poverty and chaos of early 20th century New York. Like many children of his generation and circumstances, he was drawn to the neighborhood's criminal elements, starting with petty theft and graduating to more serious offenses as he matured. By the 1930s, he had become a member of the Bonanno crime family, one of New York's 5 major organized crime groups. His specialty was narcotics trafficking, a business that the older generation of mobsters considered too risky, but which Galante saw as the future of organized crime. Heroin, in particular, offered profit margins that traditional rackets like gambling and loan sharking could never match. His rise through the ranks was marked by exceptional brutality, even by the standards of organized crime. Galante was said to have personally killed dozens of men, often torturing them first to extract information or simply for his own sadistic pleasure. Other mobsters spoke of him in whispers, sharing stories of his explosive temper and his willingness to kill over the smallest perceived slights. In 1962, Galante was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for narcotics trafficking. During his incarceration, he continued to run his operations through intermediaries, while carefully studying the changing dynamics of organized crime. When he was released in 1974, he found a landscape that had been transformed by prosecutions, deaths, and power struggles. The aging leadership of the Bonanno family was in disarray, weakened by internal conflicts and federal investigations. Galante saw an opportunity to seize control and immediately began consolidating power through a combination of strategic alliances and strategic eliminations. His ultimate goal was not just to run the Bonanno family, but to become the dominant figure in all of New York's organized crime. His strategy centered on the heroin trade, which had exploded during his years in prison. Galante forged connections with suppliers in Sicily and South America, establishing distribution and networks that stretched across the United States. The profits were enormous, but so were the risks, as federal drug enforcement agencies were becoming increasingly sophisticated and aggressive. By 1978, Galante had effectively taken control of the Bonanno family, though he had never been formally recognized as boss by the other New York families. This lack of official sanction didn't concern him. He believed that his wealth and firepower made him untouchable. He began demanding tribute from other families' narcotics operations and muscling in on territories that had been controlled by rivals for decades. The other New York bosses watched Galante's expansion with growing alarm. His disregard for traditional boundaries and protocols threatened to destabilize the entire system that had governed organized crime since the 1930s. More importantly, his high-profile drug trafficking was attracting federal attention that could destroy them all. By early 1979, the leaders of the other four New York families had reached a consensus. Carmine Galante had to be eliminated. The decision was not made lightly, as killing a sitting boss without proper authorization had traditionally been punishable by death. However, Galante's refusal to respect established protocols meant that normal rules no longer applied. The contract on Galante's life was given to members of his own organization, men who had grown tired of his paranoid leadership and constant demands for tribute. The irony was fitting. The man who had lived by betrayal would die by it as well. On that July afternoon, Galante had lunch at Joe and Mary's restaurant with his usual companions, his bodyguard, Leonard Coppola, and his cousin Giuseppe Turano, who owned the restaurant. Also present was Cesare Bonventre, a young Sicilian immigrant who served as one of Galante's most trusted associates. The meal was leisurely, conducted in the restaurant's back patio, where Galante felt safe from both surveillance and attack. He was in good spirits, discussing business matters while enjoying his food and, as always, smoking one of his expensive cigars. The setting felt secure, surrounded as it was by high walls and accessible only through the restaurant's interior. At approximately 2:45 p.m., three men wearing ski masks entered the restaurant through the front door. They moved quickly through the dining room, ignoring the few remaining customers, and headed directly for the back patio. Their purpose was clear, and their target was unmistakable. Galante looked up from his meal as the masked men appeared in the doorway leading to the patio. For a brief moment, he seemed more surprised than frightened, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Then recognition dawned, and he understood that his enemies had finally found him. The gunmen opened fire with shotguns and handguns, the sound of gunshots echoing off the patio walls. Galante was struck multiple times and fell backward in his chair, his ever-present cigar still clenched between his teeth. Leonard Coppola and Giuseppe Turano were also killed in the fusillade, their bodies crumpling beside their boss. Cesare Bonventre, who had been sitting at the table moments before, was conspicuously absent when the shooting began. He had excused himself to use the restroom just before the gunmen arrived, a timing that investigators later found highly suspicious. His survival while his companions died marked him as a likely participant in the conspiracy. The entire assassination took less than 2 minutes. The gunmen walked calmly out of the restaurant and disappeared into the Brooklyn streets, leaving behind a scene of carnage that would become one of the most infamous crime scene photographs in American history. Carmine Galante slumped in his chair, dead eyes staring at nothing, his cigar still burning between his lips. The murder of Carmine Galante sent a clear message throughout the organized crime world. No one, regardless of their power or reputation, was above the collective authority of the commission. His death ended the most serious challenge to the established order since the Castellammarese War of the early 1930s. The killing also marked the beginning of a new era in narcotics trafficking, as more diplomatic leaders took control of the trade and established the cooperative relationships that would govern the business for decades to come. Galante's dream of becoming a heroin emperor died with him in that Brooklyn patio, his ambition literally going up in smoke with his final cigar. The slaying of Angelo Bruno, March 21, 1980, was the first day of spring in Philadelphia, a time when the city traditionally began to shake off the gloom of winter and look forward to warmer days ahead. For Angelo Bruno, the 69-year-old boss of Philadelphia's crime family, it had been an ordinary evening spent dining with friends at a South Philadelphia restaurant. As his car pulled up to his modest row house on Snyder Avenue, he had no idea that his 3 decades of peaceful leadership were about to end in a burst of gunfire. Bruno was an anomaly in the world of organized crime, a leader who had earned the nickname the Gentle Don for his preference for negotiation over violence. In an era when mob bosses were known for their explosive tempers and hair-trigger willingness to order executions, Bruno stood out for his measured approach to problem-solving and his genuine aversion to unnecessary bloodshed. Born Angelo Annaloro in Sicily in 1910, he had immigrated to Philadelphia with his family as a child, growing up in the same South Philadelphia neighborhoods that would later become his power base. Like many immigrants of his generation, he was drawn to the neighborhood's gambling and numbers operations, which offered opportunities for advancement that legitimate businesses rarely provided to Italian Americans. By the 1940s, Bruno had become a respected figure in Philadelphia's underworld, known for his intelligence, his diplomatic skills, and his ability to resolve disputes without resorting to violence. When the previous boss died in 1959, Bruno was chosen to lead the family despite being younger and less obviously aggressive than several other candidates. His leadership style was revolutionary for its time. Rather than ruling through fear and intimidation, Bruno preferred to build consensus among his subordinates and to resolve conflicts through negotiation and compromise. He established territories for different crews within the family and created mechanisms for resolving disputes that didn't involve bloodshed. This approach proved remarkably successful. Under Bruno's leadership, the Philadelphia family enjoyed unprecedented prosperity and stability. They controlled a vast network of illegal gambling operations, labor unions, and legitimate businesses throughout the Delaware Valley. More importantly, they did so without attracting the kind of law enforcement attention that plagued more violent crime families in other cities. Bruno's philosophy extended to his relationships with other crime families as well. He maintained cordial relations with the New York families and served as a mediator in disputes between different criminal organizations. His reputation for fairness and his ability to find mutually acceptable solutions made him a valuable ally and a trusted neutral party in interfamily conflicts. However, Bruno's peaceful approach also created tensions within his own organization. Many younger members of the family, particularly those involved in narcotics trafficking, chafed under his conservative leadership. They viewed his reluctance to expand into drug dealing as a missed opportunity that was costing them millions of dollars in potential profits. The drug trade had exploded during the 1970s, offering profit margins that traditional criminal enterprises could never match. While other crime families were making fortunes from heroin and cocaine trafficking, Bruno insisted on sticking to gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. His caution was based on his belief that drug trafficking would inevitably attract federal attention and destabilize his carefully constructed organization. This philosophical divide created a dangerous schism within the Philadelphia family. On one side stood Bruno and his longtime associates, who valued stability and longevity over quick profits. On the other side were younger members who saw drug trafficking as the future of organized crime and viewed Bruno's restrictions as outdated and counterproductive. The situation was further complicated by Bruno's relationship with Antonio Caponigro, his underboss and presumed successor. Caponigro had grown increasingly frustrated with Bruno's conservative approach and had begun to establish his own connections with drug suppliers, despite explicit orders to avoid the narcotics trade. By 1980, the tension between Bruno and Caponigro had reached a breaking point. Federal investigators later discovered that Caponigro had been meeting secretly with members of the Genovese crime family in New York, apparently seeking their support for a move against Bruno. The New York mobsters encouraged Caponigro's ambitions, seeing an opportunity to gain influence over Philadelphia's lucrative criminal enterprises. The decision to kill Angelo Bruno was not made lightly. He was widely respected throughout the organized crime world, and his murder would inevitably trigger a violent succession struggle that could destabilize criminal operations throughout the Northeast. However, the potential profits from controlling Philadelphia's drug trade were too tempting to ignore. On the evening of March 21st, Bruno had dinner at Villa di Roma, a popular South Philadelphia restaurant where he was a regular customer. He dined with friends and associates, enjoying the kind of leisurely meal that had become a ritual for him in his later years. There was nothing unusual about the evening. It was the kind of ordinary social gathering that Bruno had enjoyed countless times before. After dinner, Bruno was driven home by his driver and bodyguard, John Stanfa. The ride through South Philadelphia's familiar streets was routine, with Bruno sitting in the passenger seat of his Oldsmobile sedan, probably reflecting on the evening's conversations and planning the next day's activities. As the car pulled up in front of Bruno's house on Snyder Avenue, a figure emerged from the shadows between two parked cars. The assassin approached the passenger side of the vehicle, where Bruno was sitting, and without warning fired a shotgun blast through the window at point-blank range. The shotgun blast killed Bruno instantly, the force of the impact throwing him against the driver's side of the car. John Stanfa, sitting behind the wheel, was wounded by flying glass and debris, but survived the attack. The assassin disappeared into the night, leaving behind a scene of shocking violence in what had been one of Philadelphia's most peaceful neighborhoods. The murder of Angelo Bruno marked the end of an era in Philadelphia organized crime. The man who had brought 3 decades of stability and prosperity to the city's underworld was dead, killed by the very forces he had tried to keep under control. The aftermath was exactly what Bruno had feared. His death triggered a violent succession struggle that lasted for years, with various factions fighting for control of the family's operations. The peaceful organization that he had built was torn apart by internal warfare, and many of its members were either killed or imprisoned. Antonio Caponegro's victory was short-lived. Within weeks of Bruno's murder, he was found dead in the trunk of a car in the Bronx, killed by the same New York mobsters who had encouraged his rebellion. The commission had decided that Caponegro's unauthorized hit on a sitting boss could not be tolerated, regardless of their own involvement in the conspiracy. The killing of the gentle Don became a symbol of how the drug trade was corrupting and destroying the traditional values of organized crime. Bruno had represented an older generation of mobsters who valued honor, loyalty, and stability over quick profits and flashy violence. His death marked the triumph of a newer, more brutal approach that would ultimately prove self-destructive. The murder of Bugsy Siegel, June 20th, 1947, was a warm Friday evening in Beverly Hills, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was relaxing in the living room of his girlfriend's mansion on North Linden Drive. The 41-year-old mobster was reading the Los Angeles Times, catching up on the day's news while enjoying a rare moment of peace. Outside, the California sun was setting behind the palm trees, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of one of America's most exclusive neighborhoods. Siegel was a man who had always lived life on his own terms, a charismatic gangster who had helped transform Las Vegas from a dusty railroad town into America's gambling capital. But on this quiet evening, his past was finally catching up with him, and enemies he had made through years of violence and betrayal were preparing to settle their accounts. Born in Brooklyn in 1906 to Jewish immigrant parents, Siegel had grown up on the rough streets of the Lower East Side, where survival often depended on one's willingness to fight. He formed a close friendship with Meyer Lansky, another young Jewish gangster, and together they built a criminal empire that would eventually span the entire United States. Unlike many of his contemporaries who remained tied to specific neighborhoods or ethnic groups, Siegel possessed a vision that transcended traditional boundaries. He saw opportunities where others saw only obstacles, and he had the charisma and ruthlessness necessary to turn his dreams into reality. During Prohibition, Siegel and Lansky became major players in the bootlegging trade, working with Italian crime families while maintaining their independence. Siegel's specialty was violence. He was said to have personally killed dozens of men, often in spectacularly brutal fashion. His explosive temper and complete lack of fear made him a valuable enforcer, but also created numerous enemies who were patiently waiting for an opportunity to strike back. In the 1930s, Siegel moved to Los Angeles, ostensibly to oversee the organization's West Coast operations, but really because he was fascinated by Hollywood's glamour and excitement. He quickly established himself in the film community, befriending actors, directors, and producers, while simultaneously running illegal gambling operations and drug trafficking networks. His personal life was as dramatic as any Hollywood production. Despite being married with children, Siegel carried on numerous affairs with actresses and socialites, living openly with his mistresses while his wife remained in New York. His most serious relationship was with Virginia Hill, a beautiful Alabama native who had connections throughout organized crime and had been the mistress of several prominent mobsters. It was through Hill that Siegel became involved in the project that would define his legacy, the development of Las Vegas as a gambling destination. In 1945, he took control of the Flamingo Hotel and Casino, a struggling project that he believed could become the crown jewel of Nevada's emerging gambling industry. Siegel's vision for the Flamingo was revolutionary. Rather than simply offering gambling, he wanted to create a complete entertainment destination with luxury accommodations, fine dining, and world-class entertainment. He believed that Americans were ready for a more sophisticated gambling experience than the crude operations that had traditionally characterized the industry. However, his ambitions far exceeded his resources. The Flamingo's construction costs spiraled out of control, partly due to Siegel's perfectionism and partly due to widespread theft and corruption among the contractors. What had been budgeted as a $1.5 million project eventually cost more than $6 million, much of it borrowed from his organized crime associates. The money came primarily from the syndicate that Siegel and Lansky had helped create, a loose confederation of crime families that pooled resources for major projects. The other members of this organization had initially supported the Flamingo project, seeing it as a legitimate investment that could generate enormous profits. However, as costs mounted and completion dates were repeatedly postponed, their patience began to wear thin. The situation became critical when the Flamingo finally opened in December 1946. Despite a star-studded grand opening featuring performers like Jimmy Durante and Xavier Cugat, the casino was a financial disaster. Poor weather kept many potential customers away, and those who did attend found that many of the hotel's amenities were still under construction. Siegel was forced to close the Flamingo after just 2 weeks, ostensibly for renovations, but really because he was running out of money. His investors were furious, having poured millions of dollars into what appeared to be a failing venture. Rumors began circulating that Siegel was skimming money from the construction budget and hiding it in Swiss bank accounts. When the Flamingo reopened in March 1947, it initially showed signs of success. The casino was profitable, and the hotel was beginning to attract the kind of upscale clientele that Siegel had envisioned. However, the profits were not sufficient to repay the massive debts that had accumulated during construction, and Siegel's investors remained deeply skeptical of his management abilities. The final straw came when Meyer Lansky, Siegel's oldest friend and closest ally, began to have doubts about the project's viability. Lansky had always been the more practical of the two partners, and he was increasingly concerned that Siegel's flamboyant lifestyle and poor business decisions were jeopardizing their entire organization. By June 1947, the decision had been made. Benjamin Siegel had become too much of a liability to be allowed to live. The contract on his life was authorized by the syndicate's leadership council, with the understanding that his death would allow them to take direct control of the Flamingo and salvage their investment. On the evening of June 20th, Siegel was at Virginia Hill's mansion on North Linden Drive. Hill herself was conveniently absent, having traveled to Europe on what she claimed was a shopping trip, but which investigators later suspected was a carefully planned alibi. Siegel was alone except for Alan Smiley, a longtime associate who was visiting from New York. The two men had spent a quiet evening together, dining at a local restaurant before returning to the mansion around 10:15 p.m. Siegel settled into his favorite spot on the living room couch, a floral print sofa positioned near the large picture window that offered a view of the landscape garden. He picked up the evening edition of the Los Angeles Times and began reading, unaware that a gunman was positioning himself in the garden outside. At approximately 10:45 p.m., 9 shots were fired through the living room window from a .30 caliber military carbine. The first bullet struck Siegel in the head, killing him instantly and sending his right eye flying across the room. The subsequent shots were unnecessary but demonstrated the assassin's thoroughness and the depth of anger felt by those who had ordered the hit. Alan Smiley, who had been sitting nearby, was miraculously uninjured despite the barrage of gunfire. He immediately called the police, reporting that his friend had been killed by an unknown assailant. His survival led to speculation that he had advanced knowledge of the attack, though nothing was ever proven. The murder of Bugsy Siegel sent shock waves through both the criminal underworld and legitimate society. Here was a man who had moved freely between the worlds of organized crime and Hollywood glamour, who had been building what would become one of America's most famous casinos, gunned down in one of the country's most exclusive neighborhoods. The assassination was never officially solved, though law enforcement agencies identified several likely suspects. The most credible theory pointed to professional killers sent by the syndicate's leadership, men who had traveled to Los Angeles specifically to eliminate Siegel and send a message about the consequences of betraying one's partners. Within hours of Siegel's death, syndicate representatives arrived in Las Vegas to take control of the Flamingo. The casino's operations continued without interruption, and under new management, it became profitable almost immediately. Siegel's vision of Las Vegas as America's gambling capital proved to be correct, though he did not live to see its full realization. The murder of Bugsy Siegel became one of the most famous unsolved crimes in American history, inspiring countless books, movies, and television shows. His death marked the end of an era in organized crime, when individual charisma and vision could sometimes triumph over collective decision-making. The man who had dreamed of building an empire in the desert was ultimately destroyed by the very qualities that had made him successful: his ambition, his independence, and his unwillingness to accept limitations imposed by others. The assassination of Johnny Torrio. The morning of January 24th, 1925, dawned gray and cold in Chicago, with a kind of bitter wind that cut through even the heaviest overcoats. Johnny Torrio, the 42-year-old boss of Chicago's South Side gang, was returning from a shopping trip with his wife Anna, their arms full of packages from the city's finest department stores. As their chauffeur-driven Cadillac pulled up to their apartment building on South Clyde Avenue, neither Torrio nor his wife noticed the black sedan that had been following them for several blocks. Torrio was a man who had spent his entire adult life in the criminal underworld, yet he had managed to maintain an almost respectable facade. Unlike many of his contemporaries who flaunted their wealth and power, Torrio dressed conservatively, spoke softly, and conducted himself with the dignity of a successful businessman. This understated approach had served him well, allowing him to build one of America's most profitable criminal enterprises, while avoiding the kind of publicity that often proved fatal to his more flamboyant rivals. Born in Montepulciano, Italy, in 1882, Torrio had immigrated to New York as a child with his widowed mother. Growing up in the poverty of Manhattan's Lower East Side, he quickly learned that survival often depended on one's willingness to bend the law. By his teens, he was running numbers for local bookmakers and organizing other neighborhood youth into profitable criminal ventures. His big break came when he attracted the attention of Paul Kelly, one of New York's most powerful gang leaders. Kelly recognized Torrio's intelligence and organizational abilities, promoting him rapidly through the ranks of his criminal organization. Under Kelly's tutelage, Torrio learned the importance of building alliances, avoiding unnecessary violence, and maintaining good relationships with corrupt politicians and police officials. In 1909, Torrio received an offer that would change his life. His cousin, James Colosimo, wanted him to come to Chicago to help manage his growing empire of brothels, gambling houses, and saloons. Chicago was booming, and Colosimo needed someone he could trust to help him take advantage of the city's seemingly limitless opportunities. Torrio arrived in Chicago to find a city where corruption was not just tolerated, but institutionalized. Politicians, police chiefs, and judges were openly for sale, creating an environment where criminal enterprises could operate with virtual impunity as long as they paid the right people and avoided excessive violence. Under Colosimo's guidance, Torrio quickly established himself as one of the city's most effective criminal organizers. He streamlined operations, eliminated inefficiencies, and established the kind of systematic approach to crime that would later become the standard for organized criminal enterprises throughout America. However, Torrio's vision extended far beyond his cousin's traditional activities. When Prohibition was enacted in 1920, he immediately recognized the enormous profit potential of illegal alcohol distribution. He tried to convince Colosimo to enter the bootlegging business, but the older man was satisfied with his existing operations and reluctant to take on new risks. This philosophical difference led to tragedy. In May 1920, James Colosimo was murdered in his own restaurant, killed by unknown gunmen while waiting for what he believed was a routine business meeting. While the crime was never officially solved, most observers believed that Torrio had ordered his cousin's death to clear the way for his own expansion into bootlegging. With Colosimo gone, Torrio moved quickly to seize control of the organization and transform it into something unprecedented, a criminal enterprise that operated more like a modern corporation than a traditional gang. He established territories, created hierarchies, and developed systems for resolving disputes without resorting to violence. His most important recruit was Alphonse Capone, a young New York gangster whom Torrio brought to Chicago in 1919. Capone possessed the kind of charisma and ruthlessness that Torrio needed to enforce his policies and intimidate potential rivals. Under Torrio's guidance, Capone learned the importance of political corruption, strategic planning, and systematic organization. Together, Torrio and Capone built an empire that controlled much of Chicago's illegal alcohol trade. They established relationships with breweries, developed distribution networks, and created retail outlets throughout the city. Their operations were so sophisticated that they employed accountants, lawyers, and public relations specialists, making them one of the first truly modern criminal organizations. However, success brought new challenges. Other criminal groups wanted their share of the bootlegging profits, leading to increasingly violent territorial disputes. The North Side Gang, led by Dean O'Banion, proved particularly troublesome, constantly encroaching on Torio's territory and disrupting his carefully planned operations. The situation reached a crisis point in November 1924 when O'Banion was murdered in his flower shop by gunmen believed to be working for Torio. The killing eliminated a major rival, but also triggered a violent response from O'Banion's allies, who swore vengeance against Torio and everyone associated with him. Jaime Weiss and George Bugs Morin, O'Banion's top lieutenants, began planning their retaliation immediately. They knew that killing Torio would be extremely difficult, as he was protected by bodyguards and rarely ventured into areas where they could attack him safely. However, they were patient men who understood that eventually everyone made mistakes. Their opportunity came on that January morning when Torio made an uncharacteristic decision to go shopping with his wife without his usual security detail. Perhaps he felt safe in the affluent neighborhood where he lived, or perhaps he wanted to give Anna a normal experience free from the constant presence of armed guards. Whatever his reasoning, it nearly cost him his life. As Torio and Anna stepped out of their Cadillac, two men emerged from the black sedan that had been following them. Both were armed with revolvers, and they approached their targets with the calm efficiency of professional killers. Torio, seeing the danger, pushed his wife toward the building entrance and tried to shield her with his own body. The gunman opened fire immediately, striking Torio multiple times in the chest, abdomen, and jaw. He collapsed on the sidewalk, blood pooling beneath him as Anna screamed for help. The assassins continued shooting, apparently determined to ensure that their target was dead. However, Torio proved remarkably resilient. Despite his severe wounds, he remained conscious and was able to speak to the police officers who arrived within minutes of the shooting. When asked who had shot him, he reportedly replied, "No one. I don't know who they were." This adherence to the criminal code of silence, even while dying, demonstrated the kind of discipline that had made him so successful. Miraculously, Torio survived the assassination attempt. He was rushed to a nearby hospital where surgeons worked for hours to save his life. The bullets had caused extensive internal damage, but none had struck vital organs. His survival was considered nothing short of miraculous by the medical staff who treated him. The shooting sent shockwaves through Chicago's criminal underworld. Torio had been considered untouchable, a man whose intelligence and careful planning had made him immune to the kind of violence that claimed so many of his contemporaries. His near-death experience demonstrated that no one, regardless of their power or precautions, was truly safe in the increasingly violent world of Prohibition-era crime. While recovering from his wounds, Torio made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He decided to retire from active criminal leadership. The assassination attempt had convinced him that the violence was spiraling out of control and that continuing to lead his organization would inevitably result in his death. He turned over control of his entire criminal empire to Al Capone, his protege and most trusted lieutenant. This transition marked a changing of the guard in Chicago organized crime, as the measured, diplomatic Torio was replaced by the more flamboyant and violent Capone. Torio's retirement probably saved his life. He moved to New York, where he lived quietly for several years before eventually returning to Chicago. He avoided the spotlight and rarely spoke publicly about his criminal career, understanding that discretion was essential for survival in his world. The assassination attempt against Johnny Torrio became a turning point in the history of American organized crime. It demonstrated how the enormous profits from bootlegging were corrupting the traditional codes and structures that had previously governed criminal behavior. The measured business-like approach that Torrio represented was being replaced by a more violent and unpredictable style that would ultimately prove self-destructive. The killing of Dutch Schultz. October 23, 1935, was a crisp autumn evening in Newark, New Jersey, and the Palace Chop House was filled with the usual dinner crowd of local businessmen and neighborhood regulars. In a back booth, away from the main dining area, sat Arthur Flegenheimer, better known throughout the criminal underworld as Dutch Schultz. The 33-year-old beer baron was enjoying a quiet meal with three of his most trusted associates, unaware that professional killers were already moving into position around the restaurant. Schultz was a man who had clawed his way from the poverty of the Bronx to become one of New York's most powerful bootleggers, building an empire that generated millions of dollars annually during the height of Prohibition. But unlike many of his contemporaries who had adapted to changing circumstances after alcohol became legal again, Schultz had made a series of increasingly desperate decisions that had marked him for death. Born Arthur Simon Flegenheimer in 1901 to German Jewish immigrants, he had grown up in the rough neighborhoods of the South Bronx, where survival often depended on one's willingness to fight. His father abandoned the family when Arthur was young, leaving his mother to raise him and his sister alone. This early abandonment created a deep anger in the boy that would fuel his violent rise through the criminal underworld. The nickname Dutch Schultz came from his association with a local gang called the Frog Hollow Crew, which had been named after a 19th century New York street tough. The name stuck, and Arthur Flegenheimer gradually disappeared behind the persona of Dutch Schultz, a man who was feared throughout New York for his explosive temper and his willingness to kill anyone who crossed him. During Prohibition, Schultz built one of the most profitable bootlegging operations in the city, controlling beer distribution throughout the Bronx and Upper Manhattan. His business model was simple but effective. He provided high-quality beer at competitive prices while eliminating competition through intimidation and violence. Saloon owners who bought from rivals often found their establishments destroyed and their owners hospitalized or worse. What set Schultz apart from many other bootleggers was his hands-on approach to violence. While bosses like Johnny Torrio and Lucky Luciano preferred to delegate enforcement to subordinates, Schultz often personally participated in beatings and killings. His reputation for brutality was legendary, and stories of his savage temper spread throughout the underworld, making enemies reluctant to challenge him directly. However, Schultz's violent methods also created numerous enemies who were patiently waiting for an opportunity to strike back. Unlike more diplomatic criminals who built alliances and maintained peaceful relationships with rivals, Schultz ruled through fear alone, creating a constantly unstable situation that required ever-increasing levels of violence to maintain. When Prohibition ended in 1933, many bootleggers successfully transitioned to other criminal enterprises or even legitimate businesses. Schultz, however, struggled to adapt to the changing environment. His beer business evaporated overnight, and he was forced to rely increasingly on his numbers racket, a gambling operation that was profitable but generated far less revenue than bootlegging had provided. The numbers game, also known as policy, was a form of illegal lottery that was particularly popular in working-class neighborhoods. Players would bet small amounts on three-digit numbers, with winners receiving payouts of several hundred to one. The game required minimal capital to operate, but depended on maintaining the trust of players who had to believe that the results were honest and that winners would be paid promptly. Schultz's operation was one of the largest in New York, processing thousands of bets daily and generating substantial profits. However, he was constantly battling rivals who wanted to muscle in on his territory, and he was facing increasing pressure from law enforcement officials who were determined to shut down illegal gambling operations. His problems intensified when federal prosecutors began investigating his tax payments. Unlike Al Capone, who had been brought down by tax evasion charges, Schultz initially tried to fight the government's case in court. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming, and it became clear that he was facing the possibility of decades in federal prison. In desperation, Schultz made a decision that would seal his fate. He decided to kill Thomas Dewey, the ambitious federal prosecutor who was leading the investigation against him. Dewey had built his reputation by successfully prosecuting major criminal figures, and he saw Schultz as his next high-profile target. The plan to assassinate a federal prosecutor was unprecedented and incredibly dangerous. While organized crime figures had killed police officers, judges, and even politicians, they had always avoided targeting high-profile federal officials because of the inevitable massive retaliation that would follow. When word of Schultz's plan reached the leadership of the National Crime Syndicate, they were horrified. Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and the other bosses understood that killing Dewey would bring down the full force of the federal government on all of their operations. They tried to talk Schultz out of his plan, but he refused to listen to reason. The commission faced an impossible situation. They could not allow Schultz to proceed with his plan to kill Dewey, as it would destroy everything they had built. At the same time, they could not simply order him to abandon the assassination, as he had made it clear that he would not be deterred. The only solution was to eliminate Schultz before he could carry out his suicidal mission. The contract on Dutch Schultz's life was given to Charlie the Bug Workman, a professional killer who specialized in high-profile assassinations. Workman was chosen because of his reputation for efficiency and his ability to disappear after completing a job. He was accompanied by Emmanuel Mendy Weiss, another experienced gunman who would serve as backup and lookout. On the evening of October 23rd, Schultz was having dinner at the Palace Chop House with three companions: Otto Berman, his accountant and numbers operation manager; Abe Landau, his bodyguard and enforcer; and Lulu Rosenkrantz, another trusted associate who handled various aspects of his criminal enterprises. The restaurant was one of Schultz's regular haunts, a place where he felt safe conducting business while enjoying good food in the company of his closest associates. The owner knew him well and always provided a quiet booth in the back where they could talk privately without being overheard by other diners. The conversation that evening focused on the mounting pressure from federal investigators and the various strategies they might employ to avoid prosecution. Schultz was increasingly paranoid, convinced that informants were everywhere and that his enemies were closing in from all directions. His companions tried to reassure him, but they could see that the stress was taking its toll on their boss. At approximately 9 p.m., Schultz excused himself from the table and walked to the restaurant's men's room. It was a routine trip, the kind of ordinary moment that occurs thousands of times in everyone's life. But for Dutch Schultz, it would be his last moment of normalcy. Charlie Workman and Mendy Weiss entered the restaurant through the front door, moving casually as if they were simply customers looking for a table. They had studied the layout carefully and knew exactly where to find their targets. Weiss positioned himself near the dining room entrance, while Workman headed toward the back booth where Schultz's companions were sitting. Workman opened fire without warning, using a .38 caliber revolver to gun down Berman, Landau, and Rosenkrantz as they sat at the table. The three men had no chance to defend themselves. They were killed almost instantly in a hail of gunfire that sent other diners screaming and diving for cover. Hearing the shots, Workman realized that Schultz was not at the table. He quickly located the men's room and kicked open the door to find his primary target standing at the urinal, momentarily frozen with shock at the sound of gunfire. Workman fired once, striking Schultz in the abdomen, then fled the restaurant as police sirens began wailing in the distance. Dutch Schultz did not die immediately. The bullet had caused severe internal damage, but he remained conscious and was able to speak to the police officers and paramedics who arrived at the scene. However, his responses were often incoherent, a mixture of delirium caused by blood loss and his natural reluctance to cooperate with law enforcement. He was rushed to Newark City Hospital, where surgeons worked desperately to save his life. For more than 20 hours, Schultz hovered between life and death, occasionally regaining consciousness long enough to mutter cryptic statements that investigators hoped might provide clues about his criminal activities or the identity of his killers. Some of his final words were recorded by a police stenographer and later became famous for their surreal stream of consciousness quality. "A boy has never wept nor dashed 1,000 Kim. You can play jacks, and girls do that with a softball and do tricks with it. Oh, dog biscuit. And when he is happy, he doesn't get snappy." On October 24, 1935, Dutch Schultz died from his wounds, taking with him the secrets of his vast criminal empire and any information he might have possessed about other organized crime figures. His death marked the end of one of the most violent and unpredictable careers in the history of American organized crime. The murder of Dutch Schultz achieved its intended purpose. The plan to assassinate Thomas Dewey died with him. The federal prosecutor went on to become governor of New York and later ran for president, never knowing how close he had come to being killed by a desperate gangster's final gambit. Charlie Workman was eventually identified as the triggerman and was convicted of murder, receiving a life sentence. However, he served only 23 years before being paroled, dying peacefully in Florida decades later. Mendy Weiss was executed in the electric chair for his role in another murder, meeting the violent end that awaited so many men in his profession. The killing of Dutch Schultz demonstrated the ruthless pragmatism of the organized crime leadership. When one of their own threatened to bring destruction upon them all, They did not hesitate to eliminate him, regardless of past loyalties or shared profits. It was a cold calculation that prioritized the survival of the organization over the life of any individual member. Schultz's death also marked the end of an era in New York organized crime. The wild, unpredictable violence that had characterized the Prohibition years was giving way to a more businesslike approach that emphasized cooperation over conflict and negotiation over confrontation. The man who had lived by the gun in the most literal sense had died by it, leaving behind a legacy of violence that served as a warning to anyone who might challenge the new order. The betrayal of Joe Masseria. April 15, 1931, was a pleasant spring afternoon in Coney Island, and Nuova Villa Tomato restaurant was filled with the cheerful sounds of families enjoying their traditional Italian meals. At a corner table away from the main dining area sat Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria, the 45-year-old Don who controlled much of New York's Italian-American underworld. He was sharing a leisurely lunch with his most trusted lieutenant, Charles Lucky Luciano, completely unaware that he was about to become the victim of one of the most calculated betrayals in organized crime history. Masseria was a man who represented the old world in every sense. Born in Sicily in 1886, he had immigrated to New York as a teenager, bringing with him the traditional codes and methods of the Sicilian mafia. He was a figure from another era, a mustached patriarch who conducted business in broken English and settled disputes with the kind of brutal directness that had characterized organized crime for centuries. His rise to power had been marked by exceptional violence, even by the standards of early 20th century organized crime. Masseria was said to have personally killed dozens of men, often in spectacularly public fashion that served as warnings to potential rivals. His nickname, Joe the Boss, was not honorary. He had earned it through years of systematic elimination of anyone who challenged his authority. By the late 1920s, Masseria controlled a vast criminal empire that included illegal gambling operations, bootlegging networks, and protection rackets throughout Manhattan and Brooklyn. His organization was structured along traditional Sicilian lines, with absolute loyalty demanded from subordinates and death as the penalty for betrayal or disrespect. However, the world around Masseria was changing rapidly. Prohibition had created opportunities for cooperation between different ethnic criminal groups, and younger Italian-American gangsters were beginning to question the wisdom of the old ways. They saw profit in working with Jewish and Irish criminals, while Masseria insisted on maintaining traditional boundaries and hierarchies. The most vocal advocate for this new approach was Lucky Luciano, a young Sicilian immigrant who had arrived in America as a child and grown up speaking perfect English. Unlike Masseria, who remained tied to the customs of the old country, Luciano understood American business methods and saw enormous potential in applying them to criminal enterprises. Under Masseria's patronage, Luciano had built his own crew and established himself as one of New York's most effective criminal organizers. He controlled prostitution networks, ran gambling operations, and had extensive connections in the bootlegging trade. More importantly, he had developed relationships with non-Italian criminals that Masseria viewed with deep suspicion. The philosophical differences between the two men came to a head during the Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict that raged from 1929 to 1931 between Masseria's faction and a rival group led by Salvatore Maranzano. The war was ostensibly about territory and respect, but it really represented a struggle between different visions of how organized crime should operate in America. Maranzano represented an even more traditional approach than Masseria, wanting to establish a rigid hierarchy based strictly on Sicilian customs. His faction was composed primarily of recent immigrants from the town of Castellammare del Golfo, and they viewed both Masseria and his American-born lieutenants as corrupted by their exposure to American culture. The war was devastating for all involved. Bodies dropped regularly across New York City, with both sides losing valuable personnel and attracting unwanted attention from law enforcement. Restaurants became battlefields, and trusted allies turned into deadly enemies overnight. The violence was so intense that it began disrupting the profitable operations that both sides were supposedly fighting to protect. Luciano watched this destruction with growing frustration. He understood that the war was ultimately pointless, benefiting no one except the police and federal agents who were using the chaos to build cases against organized crime figures. More importantly, he saw that both Masseria and Maranzano represented obstacles to his vision of a more rational and profitable approach to criminal enterprise. Working in secret, Luciano began reaching out to other young leaders in both factions, men who shared his belief that the old ways were leading to mutual destruction. He proposed a radical solution: eliminate both Masseria and Maranzano, then establish a new structure based on cooperation rather than endless warfare. The plan required incredible audacity and perfect timing. Luciano would have to betray his own boss while simultaneously negotiating with his supposed enemies. One mistake would result in his own death, but success would revolutionize American organized crime. The first step was to gain Maranzano's trust by offering to eliminate Masseria. Luciano sent emissaries to the Castellamarese faction, proposing a deal. He would arrange for Masseria's assassination in exchange for a guarantee of safety for himself and his crew. Maranzano, eager to end the costly war, agreed to the arrangement. On that April afternoon, Luciano invited Masseria to lunch at Nuova Villa Tamaro, a small restaurant in Coney Island that was far from the usual haunts where either man might be recognized. The location was chosen carefully. It was isolated enough to provide privacy, but public enough to seem innocent. The two men enjoyed a relaxed meal together, discussing business matters and planning future operations. Masseria was in good spirits, believing that he was finally gaining the upper hand in his war with Maranzano. He had no reason to suspect that his most trusted lieutenant was plotting against him. The conversation was conducted in Italian, as was Masseria's preference, and covered a wide range of topics from territorial disputes to family matters. Luciano played his role perfectly, appearing attentive and loyal while internally counting down the minutes until his boss's death. After finishing their main course, the two men decided to play a few hands of cards while waiting for dessert. This was a common practice for Masseria, who was an avid card player and often conducted business while gambling. They moved to a quieter table in the back of the restaurant, where they could play without interruption. At approximately 3:30 p.m., as the game was reaching its climax, Luciano excused himself to use the men's room. This was the signal that his confederates had been waiting for. As soon as Luciano disappeared from view, 4 gunmen entered the restaurant through different entrances, moving quickly toward Masseria's table. Joe, the boss, looked up from his cards to see armed men approaching from multiple directions. For a brief moment, his face showed surprise rather than fear, as if he couldn't quite process what was happening. Then understanding dawned, and he realized that he had been betrayed by the man he had trusted most. The gunmen opened fire simultaneously, using .32 and .38 caliber revolvers to pump multiple bullets into Masseria's body. He fell forward onto the card table, scattering the playing cards across the floor. The entire assassination took less than 30 seconds, demonstrating the professional efficiency of the killers. When police arrived at the scene, they found Masseria dead at the table, his body riddled with bullet holes. The playing cards were scattered around him, stained with his blood. Most remarkably, they found Lucky Luciano in the restaurant's men's room, claiming to have heard nothing unusual during his absence from the table. Luciano's story was transparently false, but police had no evidence to contradict it. He claimed that he had been in the bathroom when the shooting occurred and had remained there out of fear until the gunman left. His survival while his boss was killed made him the obvious suspect, but proving his involvement was impossible without witnesses willing to testify. The murder of Joe Masseria marked the end of the Castellamarese War and the beginning of a new era in American organized crime. Within months, Luciano would eliminate Salvatore Maranzano as well, clearing the way for the establishment of the commission system that would govern organized crime for decades to come. The betrayal at Nuova Villa Tamaro became legendary in the underworld, a perfect example of how the old ways were giving way to more sophisticated and ruthless methods. Masseria had represented the last of the old-school mafia dons, men who ruled through personal charisma and brute force. His death symbolized the triumph of a new generation that valued strategic thinking over traditional loyalty. Luciano's survival and subsequent rise to power demonstrated that in the modern criminal world, intelligence and adaptability were more valuable than honor and tradition. The man who had shared meals and confidences with Joe Masseria had orchestrated his death without hesitation, proving that, in organized crime, there were no relationships so close that they could not be sacrificed for advancement. The image of Joe the boss dying over a card game, betrayed by his most trusted ally, became one of the most iconic scenes in organized crime lore. It represented not just the death of a powerful criminal, but the death of an entire way of life that had governed the underworld for generations. The birthday massacre of Crazy Joe Gallo, April 7, 1972, was a mild spring evening in Manhattan's Little Italy, and the narrow streets were alive with the sounds of celebration and the aroma of traditional Italian cooking. At Umberto's Clam House on Mulberry Street, the late dinner crowd was enjoying the restaurant's famous seafood dishes, unaware that they were about to witness one of the most shocking mob hits in New York history. In a corner booth sat Joseph Crazy Joe Gallo, celebrating his 43rd birthday with his wife, daughter, and sister, completely oblivious to the fact that professional killers were already moving into position around the restaurant. Gallo was a man who had spent his entire adult life defying the conventional wisdom of organized crime. Unlike most mobsters who preferred to operate in shadows and maintain low profiles, Crazy Joe courted publicity and seemed to revel in his reputation as an unpredictable and dangerous character. He was equally comfortable discussing literature and philosophy as he was planning violent robberies, a combination that made him both fascinating and terrifying to those who knew him. Born in Brooklyn in 1929 to a family of Italian immigrants, Gallo had grown up in the Red Hook neighborhood, one of the toughest areas in New York City. The docks dominated the local economy, and violence was a daily reality for families trying to survive in a world controlled by competing gangs and corrupt labor unions. From an early age, Gallo demonstrated the kind of fearlessness and quick intelligence that would make him a formidable criminal. Along with his brothers Larry and Albert, Joe Gallo established himself in the Brooklyn underworld during the 1950s, specializing in robberies, extortion, and murder for hire. The Gallo brothers were different from many of their contemporaries in that they operated as an independent crew, refusing to submit to the authority of the established crime families that controlled most of Brooklyn's criminal activities. This independence made them valuable allies, but also dangerous enemies. They were willing to work for anyone who could pay their prices, but they insisted on maintaining their autonomy and their right to operate in whatever territories they chose. This approach brought them into conflict with the Profaci crime family, which claimed jurisdiction over much of Brooklyn and demanded tribute from all criminal operations in their territory. The conflict escalated in 1957 when the Gallos kidnapped several high-ranking members of the Profaci organization, including the boss's brother-in-law. They demanded that Joseph Profaci reduce the tribute he was collecting from independent operators and give the Gallos a larger share of the family's illegal operations. When Profaci refused, the kidnapping turned into a full-scale war that would last for more than a decade. The Gallo-Profaci War was notable for its unusual brutality and its impact on innocent civilians. Unlike traditional mob conflicts that were conducted according to certain unwritten rules, this war saw both sides targeting family members, destroying legitimate businesses, and carrying out hits in public places where bystanders could be injured or killed. Crazy Joe emerged as the most visible and vocal leader of his faction, giving interviews to reporters and positioning himself as a reformer who was fighting against the old-fashioned and oppressive methods of the established families. He claimed that his war against Profaci was really about bringing democracy and fairness to organized crime, though his critics pointed out that his methods were often more violent than those he was supposedly opposing. During the 1960s, Gallo spent nearly 10 years in prison for extortion, but his incarceration only enhanced his reputation and his mystique. He used his time behind bars to educate himself, reading extensively in philosophy, literature, and political theory. He became particularly interested in the civil rights movement and developed friendships with several African-American inmates who shared his interest in social justice. When Gallo was released from prison in 1971, he found that the world had changed dramatically during his absence. Joseph Profaci had died of cancer and been replaced by Joseph Colombo, who had established a more sophisticated and business-oriented approach to running the crime family. More importantly, Colombo had become a public figure through his leadership of the Italian-American Civil Rights League, an organization that protested what it claimed was unfair stereotyping of Italian Americans in the media. Gallo viewed Colombo's public activities with contempt, seeing them as hypocritical publicity stunts that brought unwanted attention to organized crime. He was particularly angered by Colombo's protests against movies and television shows that depicted Italian Americans as criminals, arguing that such protests only confirmed what everyone already knew about the mafia's existence. The situation became explosive when Colombo was shot and critically wounded at a rally for the Italian American Civil Rights League in June 1971. The gunman, Jerome Johnson, was immediately killed by Colombo's bodyguards. But investigators suspected that the assassination attempt had been orchestrated by Gallo as revenge for years of conflict between their organizations. Whether or not Gallo was actually responsible for the Colombo shooting, he was widely believed to be the mastermind, and this belief made him a marked man. The Colombo family, now led by Carmine Persico, began planning their revenge while Gallo continued to operate as if he were untouchable. Gallo's sense of invulnerability was enhanced by his celebrity status and his connections to the entertainment world. He had become friendly with several actors and musicians, including Jerry Orbach and Bob Dylan, who were fascinated by his combination of intellect and criminality. These relationships gave him a sense of protection, as he believed that his high profile made him too visible to be eliminated safely. On the night of his birthday, Gallo was in exceptionally good spirits. He had spent the evening at the Copacabana nightclub with his family, enjoying dinner and a show featuring comedian Don Rickles. The celebration had been everything he had hoped for: glamorous, exciting, and filled with the kind of attention that he craved. After leaving the Copa, the Gallo party decided to continue their celebration with a late dinner at Umberto's Clam House, a popular restaurant in Little Italy that was known for staying open late and serving excellent seafood. The choice of location was significant. Little Italy was considered neutral territory where different crime families could dine without fear of violence. The Gallo party consisted of Joe and his new wife Sina, his 10-year-old daughter from a previous marriage, his sister Carmela, her date, and Gallo's bodyguard Pete the Greek Dippolis. They were seated at a corner table that provided a good view of the restaurant's entrance, a precaution that Gallo had learned during his years in the criminal underworld. The atmosphere was relaxed and festive as they ordered clams, scungilli, and other Italian specialties. Gallo was holding court, regaling his companions with stories and observations about the evening's entertainment. He seemed completely at ease, showing no signs of the paranoia that had kept him alive through years of warfare. At approximately 5:30 a.m., as the party was finishing their meal, 4 men entered Umberto's through the front door. They moved casually, as if they were simply late-night diners looking for a table, but their eyes immediately focused on the Gallo party in the corner booth. The leader of the group was later identified as Joseph Luparelli, a member of the Colombo crime family who had been waiting for months for an opportunity to eliminate Gallo. He was accompanied by 3 other gunmen who had positioned themselves strategically around the restaurant to prevent their target from escaping. Gallo recognized the danger immediately. His years of experience in the criminal underworld had given him an instinct for detecting threats, and he could see from the men's movements and positioning that they were not ordinary customers. He began to rise from his seat, reaching for the gun he carried in his waistband. But the assassins were already in motion. Luparelli drew a .38 caliber revolver and began firing at the Gallo table from close range. The other gunmen opened fire simultaneously, filling the restaurant with the deafening sound of gunshots and the screams of terrified diners. Gallo was struck multiple times, but managed to stagger toward the back of the restaurant, apparently trying to reach a rear exit or find cover behind the kitchen area. Blood was streaming down his body as he stumbled through the restaurant, knocking over tables and chairs in his desperate attempt to escape. The gunman pursued him, continuing to fire as he fled. Sina Gallo threw herself on top of her stepdaughter to protect her from the flying bullets, while Pete the Greek drew his own weapon and tried to return fire. The entire restaurant had become a battlefield, with innocent diners diving under tables and running for the exits. Crazy Joe Gallo collapsed near the back of the restaurant, his body riddled with bullets. He died within minutes, his blood pooling on the checkered linoleum floor of the establishment where he had been celebrating his birthday just moments before. The assassination of Crazy Joe Gallo sent shockwaves through both the criminal underworld and the general public. Here was a figure who had become almost a folk hero to some, a charismatic rebel who had stood up to the established order and paid the ultimate price for his defiance. The murder also marked the end of one of the longest and most destructive conflicts in the history of American organized crime. The Gallo-Profaci War had claimed dozens of lives and cost both sides millions of dollars in lost revenue. With Crazy Joe's death, the surviving members of his crew either joined other families or retired from active criminal life. Joseph Luparelli, the suspected triggerman, fled to California immediately after the shooting, but eventually surrendered to federal authorities and provided information about the murder in exchange for protection. However, his testimony was not sufficient to convict anyone of the crime, and the case remains officially unsolved. The birthday massacre at Umberto's Clam House became one of the most famous mob hits in American history, inspiring countless books, movies, and songs. Bob Dylan even wrote a song about Gallo called Joey, portraying him as a tragic figure who had been destroyed by forces beyond his control. The death of Crazy Joe Gallo represented the end of an era when individual charisma and defiance could challenge the established order of organized crime. His life and death became a cautionary tale about the dangers of refusing to accept the rules that govern the underworld, no matter how unjust or arbitrary those rules might seem. The downfall of Fat Tony Salerno. The story of Anthony Fat Tony Salerno is not one of a single dramatic assassination, but rather the slow, methodical destruction of a man who had ruled New York's underworld like an emperor for decades. Unlike many of his contemporaries who met violent ends in restaurants or on street corners, Salerno's downfall came through the grinding machinery of the federal justice system, a fate that many considered worse than a quick death by gunfire. Born Antonio Salerno in East Harlem in 1911, he had grown up in one of New York's most notorious neighborhoods, where the Italian-American crime families had established their earliest strongholds. The area was a maze of social clubs, numbers operations, and legitimate businesses that served as fronts for criminal activities. From childhood, Salerno was immersed in this world, learning its codes and customs as naturally as other children learn to read and write. By the 1930s, Salerno had established himself as a significant figure in the Genovese crime family, one of New York's 5 major organized crime groups. His specialty was illegal gambling, particularly the numbers racket that was enormously popular in working-class neighborhoods throughout the city. The numbers game required minimal capital to operate, but generated enormous profits for those who could organize it efficiently and protect it from competition. Salerno's rise through the ranks was marked not by spectacular violence, but by steady, methodical expansion of his operations. He understood that successful criminal enterprises required the same attention to detail and customer service as legitimate businesses. His gambling operations became known for their honesty and reliability, qualities that attracted customers and discouraged competitors. By the 1950s, Salerno had become one of the wealthiest and most powerful figures in organized crime, controlling gambling operations throughout Manhattan and the Bronx. His organization employed hundreds of people, from street-level numbers runners to sophisticated accountants who managed the complex financial operations necessary to launder millions of dollars in illegal profits. What set Salerno apart from many of his contemporaries was his understanding of the importance of political corruption. He cultivated relationships with politicians, judges, and police officials, using a combination of bribes, favors, and strategic campaign contributions to create a protective network that insulated his operations from law enforcement interference. His headquarters was the Palma Boys Social Club on East 115th Street in East Harlem, a modest storefront that became one of the most important locations in American organized crime. From this unassuming building, Salerno controlled criminal operations that generated tens of millions of dollars annually while maintaining the fiction that he was simply a retiree who enjoyed playing cards with old friends. The social club was a masterpiece of deception. To casual observers, it appeared to be exactly what its name suggested, a place where neighborhood men gathered to play cards, watch television, and discuss current events. However, law enforcement officials knew that it was really the command center for one of America's most sophisticated criminal organizations. Salerno himself was a master of this kind of deception. Despite his wealth and power, he lived modestly in the same East Harlem neighborhood where he had grown up. He dressed conservatively, drove ordinary cars, and maintained the persona of a simple neighborhood character who happened to be popular with local businessmen and politicians. His nickname, Fat Tony, came from his considerable girth, which he maintained throughout his life, despite periodic attempts at dieting. The extra weight, combined with his jovial personality and apparent lack of pretension, made him seem harmless to those who didn't understand the true nature of his activities. However, by the 1970s, federal law enforcement agencies were beginning to develop new tools and techniques for investigating organized crime. The passage of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, in 1970 gave prosecutors powerful new weapons for attacking criminal enterprises, allowing them to charge entire organizations rather than just individual criminals. More importantly, advances in surveillance technology were making it increasingly difficult for organized crime figures to conduct business in secret. Electronic surveillance devices became smaller and more sophisticated, allowing FBI agents to monitor conversations in social clubs, restaurants, and even private homes. The investigation of Salerno and the Genovese family began in earnest in the early 1980s, when federal agents launched Operation Family Secrets, a comprehensive effort to penetrate the highest levels of New York's organized crime families. The operation involved dozens of agents and prosecutors working together to build cases that would destroy entire criminal organizations, rather than simply prosecuting individual crimes. Salerno's downfall began with electronic surveillance of the Palma Boys Social Club. FBI agents succeeded in planting listening devices throughout the building, giving them access to thousands of hours of conversations between Salerno and his associates. The recordings revealed the true extent of his criminal empire and provided evidence of his involvement in murder, extortion, gambling, and labor racketeering. The surveillance also revealed Salerno's role as the front boss of the Genovese family, a position that made him responsible for the organization's day-to-day operations, while the real boss, Vincent Chin Gigante, maintained a lower profile. This arrangement was typical of the sophisticated methods that organized crime families had developed to protect their leadership from prosecution. However, the FBI's investigation eventually penetrated even these layers of deception. Agents developed informants within the organization and used advanced surveillance techniques to document the family's structure and operations. They discovered that Salerno was not just a front boss, but was actively involved in making major decisions about the family's criminal activities. The evidence against Salerno was overwhelming. The FBI had recorded him discussing murders, ordering violent retribution against enemies, and directing the family's various criminal enterprises. They had financial records showing the movement of millions of dollars in illegal profits and testimony from cooperating witnesses who described his role in the organization's leadership. In 1986, Salerno was indicted along with the bosses of New York's other major crime families in what became known as the Commission Case. The charges included racketeering, murder, extortion, and conspiracy, with prosecutors seeking life sentences for all the defendants. The trial was a media sensation, featuring testimony from former mobsters who described the inner workings of organized crime in unprecedented detail. The prosecution presented evidence of the Commission's role in dividing territories, resolving disputes, and authorizing murders, painting a picture of organized crime as a sophisticated shadow government that operated parallel to legitimate institutions. Salerno's defense team argued that he was simply an elderly gambler who had been mistakenly identified as a major crime figure. They claimed that the surveillance recordings had been taken out of context and that their client was being prosecuted for crimes committed by others who had used his name and reputation without his knowledge. However, the evidence against him was too strong to overcome. The jury heard recordings of Salerno discussing criminal activities in his own voice, and they saw financial records that documented the flow of illegal profits through his organization. Former associates testified about his role in ordering murders and directing the family's operations. On November 19, 1986, Anthony Fat Tony Salerno was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 100 years in federal prison. At 75 years old, he faced the prospect of spending the rest of his life behind bars, a fate that many considered more cruel than the quick death that had claimed so many of his contemporaries. The conviction marked the end of an era in American organized crime. Salerno had represented the last generation of crime bosses who had operated with virtual impunity for decades, protected by corruption and the limitations of law enforcement technology. His downfall demonstrated that even the most powerful and well-protected criminals could be brought to justice by patient, methodical investigation. Salerno died in federal prison in 1992, having served only 6 years of his century-long sentence. His death marked the end of one of the longest and most successful criminal careers in American history. The man who had once controlled millions of dollars in illegal operations and commanded the respect of hundreds of subordinates died alone in a prison hospital, forgotten by the world that had once feared his power. The destruction of Fat Tony Salerno became a symbol of law enforcement's evolving ability to combat organized crime. His case demonstrated that the federal government had finally developed the tools and techniques necessary to penetrate even the most sophisticated criminal organizations and hold their leaders accountable for their crimes. The investigation that brought down Salerno also revealed the true extent of organized crime's influence on American society. The recordings from the Palma Boys Social Club showed how deeply criminal organizations had penetrated legitimate businesses, labor unions, and political institutions, corrupting everything they touched in their pursuit of profit and power. His downfall marked the beginning of the end for the traditional American mafia. The combination of RICO prosecutions, electronic surveillance, and the increasing willingness of former criminals to cooperate with authorities would destroy most of the major crime families over the following decade, ending an era that had lasted for nearly a century. Let the hush of the night wrap around you. And know this: some stories don't end. They drift. They dream. They wait for you to listen again. Good night.